Sarah Martinez never imagined that saving lives would prepare her to take them. For 12 years, she had dedicated herself to healing wounded warriors, stitching together broken bodies, and mending shattered spirits in military hospitals across 3 continents. Her hands, steady and sure, had performed countless surgeries, delivered hope to families, and brought soldiers back from the brink of death. But on that scorching afternoon in Afghanistan, as insurgent bullets shattered the windows of the field hospital and screams echoed through the corridors, those same healing hands would grip the cold steel of an M4 carbine. The SEAL commander's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Doc, forget your oath for the next 10 minutes. These men need you to fight, not heal." What happened next would challenge everything she believed about medicine, duty, and the thin line between saving life and taking it. This is the story of how a dedicated Army surgeon became an unlikely warrior, and how one impossible choice changed not just her life, but the lives of every person she would touch thereafter. Sometimes the greatest act of healing requires the courage to do the unthinkable. Sarah Martinez had always known she wanted to save lives, but she never expected that calling would lead her to some of the most dangerous places on earth. Growing up in a small Texas border town, she watched her grandmother tend to the sick and injured in their community, often working without pay for families who couldn't afford medical care. Her grandmother's weathered hands moved with precision and compassion, teaching Sarah that medicine was more than science. It was a sacred duty to preserve human life. The path to becoming an Army surgeon hadn't been easy. Sarah's family struggled financially, and medical school seemed like an impossible dream until she discovered the military's health profession scholarship program. The deal was straightforward. The Army would pay for her medical education, and, in return, she would serve as a military physician for 8 years. It seemed perfect. She could pursue her calling while serving her country. Medical school at the University of Texas challenged every assumption Sarah had about her capabilities. The endless hours of study, the pressure of life and death decisions, and the emotional toll of watching patients suffer pushed her to her limits. But she persevered, driven by memories of her grandmother's gentle guidance and an unwavering belief that every life was worth fighting for. During her surgical residency, Sarah specialized in trauma surgery, drawn to the adrenaline-fueled environment of emergency medicine. She thrived under pressure, her hands steady even when facing the most complex cases. Her colleagues noted her unusual calm in crisis situations, a trait that would serve her well in the years to come. She completed additional training in combat casualty care, learning to treat battlefield injuries that civilian doctors rarely encountered. Her first deployment came sooner than expected. Fresh out of residency, Sarah found herself boarding a military transport plane bound for Iraq. The year was 2009, and the war was still raging with brutal intensity. She remembered staring out the small window at the barren landscape below, her medical bag clutched tightly in her lap, wondering if her training had truly prepared her for what lay ahead. The forward operating base where Sarah was stationed sat in the heart of insurgent territory, a fortress of sand-colored walls and razor wires surrounded by hostile desert. The base hospital was a collection of prefabricated buildings connected by covered walkways, designed to provide critical medical care to wounded soldiers before evacuating them to larger facilities. The constant hum of generators and the distant rumble of helicopters became the soundtrack of her daily life. Her first week was baptism by fire. A convoy had hit an improvised explosive device just outside the base perimeter, and casualties began arriving within minutes. Sarah found herself working on multiple soldiers simultaneously, her training taking over as she triaged wounds and made split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The young sergeant on her table couldn't have been older than 20, his face pale from blood loss, calling out for his mother. Sarah's hands moved methodically, repairing damaged arteries and removing shrapnel, while she spoke softly to keep him conscious and calm. That first patient survived, as did most of the others that day. But Sarah learned that war was relentless. Before she could even clean the blood from her scrubs, another helicopter was landing with more casualties. The cycle continued day and night, an endless stream of broken bodies that needed her healing touch. Over the following months, Sarah established herself as one of the most skilled surgeons on the base. Her reputation spread beyond the hospital walls as soldiers began requesting her specifically for their medical needs. She treated everything from routine injuries to complex trauma cases, often working 18-hour shifts without complaint. Her colleagues marveled at her dedication, but Sarah saw it simply as her duty. The relationships she formed with her patients went far beyond the typical doctor-patient dynamic. In the confined environment of the forward operating base, she got to know many of the soldiers personally. She learned about their families, their dreams, their fears. She celebrated with them when they received letters from home and comforted them when they lost fellow soldiers. These men and women weren't just patients. They became her extended military family. One of the most challenging aspects of her deployment was dealing with the psychological wounds that weren't visible on X-rays or CT scans. Many soldiers struggled with the mental toll of combat, and Sarah found herself serving as an informal counselor. She learned to recognize the signs of post-traumatic stress and depression, often spending her off-duty hours talking with soldiers who needed someone to listen. The base came under regular mortar and rocket attacks, but the hospital was considered a safe zone protected by the Geneva Convention. Sarah had been trained on basic security procedures, including how to respond to attacks, but her focus remained entirely on medical care. She knew that other soldiers were responsible for base defense, and she trusted them to keep her and her patients safe while she concentrated on saving lives. As her deployment progressed, Sarah began to see patterns in the types of injuries she treated. Roadside bombs caused devastating trauma to limbs and internal organs. Sniper attacks resulted in precise wounds that were either immediately fatal or surprisingly survivable. Close-quarters combat injuries were often the most complex, involving multiple organ systems and requiring innovative surgical techniques. She developed new procedures for treating combat injuries, sharing her innovations with other military medical personnel through secure communications networks. Her work was saving lives not just at her own base, but at medical facilities across the theater of operations. The Army recognized her contributions with commendations and accelerated promotions, but Sarah remained focused on the patients in front of her rather than military politics. The isolation of deployment created an intense bond among the medical staff. Sarah worked closely with nurses, medics, and other physicians who shared her commitment to healing. They supported each other through the most difficult cases, celebrating successes and grieving losses together. The hospital became a sanctuary where the normal rules of military hierarchy gave way to medical necessity and mutual respect. Despite the constant stress and danger, Sarah found deep satisfaction in her work. Every soldier she saved was someone's son or daughter, someone's husband or wife, someone's parent or sibling. She was making a real difference in the world, using her skills to preserve precious human life in the midst of devastating conflict. The long hours and emotional toll seemed like small prices to pay for the privilege of serving those who served their country. As her first deployment neared its end, Sarah felt conflicted about returning home. Part of her missed the comforts of civilian life, but another part of her had found purpose in the crucible of war. She had discovered reserves of strength and skill she never knew she possessed. The experience had transformed her from a newly graduated surgeon into a battle-tested healer who could perform miracles under the most extreme conditions. The transition back to the United States was more difficult than she had anticipated. The routine of a stateside military hospital felt mundane after the intensity of combat medicine. Sarah found herself volunteering for additional deployments, drawn back to the place where her skills were most desperately needed. Her colleagues thought she was dedicated, but Sarah knew the truth. She had found her calling in the chaos of war, where every decision mattered and every life saved was a victory against the darkness. Her second deployment took her to Afghanistan, where the conflict had shifted but the need for skilled trauma surgeons remained constant. This time, she arrived with confidence born of experience, ready to face whatever challenges awaited. She had no way of knowing that this deployment would test not just her medical skills, but every belief she held about healing, duty, and the sacred obligation to preserve human life. The helicopter descended through clouds of dust and diesel fumes, Afghanistan stretching endlessly in every direction like a moonscape of brown mountains and hidden valleys. Sarah pressed her face to the small window, watching the forward operating base grow larger as they approached. This deployment felt different from Iraq. The terrain was more challenging, the enemy more elusive, and the stakes somehow higher. Forward Operating Base Chapman sat in a strategic valley that controlled access to several mountain passes used by insurgents moving between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The base was larger than her previous assignment, housing nearly 3,000 soldiers from various units, including special forces, conventional infantry, and aviation units. The medical facility was correspondingly more complex, with multiple operating theaters, an intensive care unit, and sophisticated diagnostic equipment. Sarah's arrival briefing painted a stark picture of the security situation. Unlike Iraq, where insurgents often used conventional tactics, the Taliban and other groups in Afghanistan favored ambush attacks, improvised explosive devices, and complex coordinated assaults on coalition bases. The enemy was patient, willing to watch and wait for weeks before striking at perceived weaknesses. Every mission outside the base walls carried significant risk. The medical team at Chapman was led by Colonel Richard Hayes, a seasoned Army surgeon who had served multiple deployments across both Iraq and Afghanistan. He welcomed Sarah with a mixture of professional respect and paternal concern. During their first meeting, he outlined the unique challenges they faced in this particular location. "The casualties we see here are different," Colonel Hayes explained, spreading photos across his desk that showed various types of combat injuries. "The insurgents have become more sophisticated in their tactics. They're using explosively formed penetrators that can punch through armored vehicles, and they've learned to coordinate attacks to maximize casualties. We also see a lot more high-altitude injuries from mountain operations." Sarah studied the photographs with clinical detachment, noting the patterns of tissue damage and the complexity of the wounds. These injuries would require every technique she had learned during her previous deployment, plus innovations she hadn't yet discovered. The challenge excited her rather than intimidating her. She had found her calling in pushing the boundaries of battlefield medicine. Her first few weeks at Chapman established a routine that would define her deployment. Morning rounds began at 0530, checking on patients who had arrived during the night. The hospital maintained a constant state of readiness, with operating theaters prepped and teams standing by for incoming casualties. Between active cases, Sarah worked on improving protocols and training junior medical staff. The base hosted several special operations units, including Navy SEAL teams that conducted high-risk missions deep in insurgent territory. Sarah quickly learned that these operators faced different types of dangers than conventional soldiers. Their missions often took them far from base support, meaning they had to manage casualties for hours before evacuation was possible. She began developing specialized trauma kits and training programs designed specifically for special operations medics. Commander Jake Morrison led one of the SEAL teams stationed at Chapman. He was a tall, quiet man in his early 30s with intelligent eyes and an economy of movement that spoke of years in combat. Unlike many special operations personnel who kept to themselves, Morrison made an effort to understand the medical capabilities available at the base. He regularly attended Sarah's trauma training sessions, asking detailed questions about casualty management under extreme conditions. "Doc, I need to know exactly what my medics can and can't handle in the field," Morrison explained after one training session. "When we're 6 hours from evacuation and someone takes a round to the chest, I need to know if we should push forward with the mission or abort immediately." Sarah appreciated his direct approach. Too many commanders made decisions about medical risks without understanding the realities of battlefield medicine. She began working closely with Morrison and his team medics, developing protocols that balanced mission requirements with patient survival odds. These sessions often extended late into the evening, with Sarah teaching advanced techniques while Morrison shared tactical scenarios that challenged her medical assumptions. The first major casualty event of her deployment came during her third week at Chapman. A convoy of armored vehicles had been ambushed in a narrow valley, and multiple soldiers were critically wounded. The helicopters began arriving just after sunset, their rotors whipping dust clouds across the landing zone as medics rushed casualties into the hospital. Sarah found herself working on a young staff sergeant who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device. The wounds were catastrophic, with massive tissue loss and contamination from dirt and debris. Under normal circumstances, such injuries might have proven fatal before reaching medical care. But the soldiers' buddies had applied tourniquets correctly and maintained pressure on arterial bleeding points, buying precious time. Working steadily through the night, Sarah managed to stabilize the sergeant and prepare him for evacuation to Germany. The surgery required rebuilding damaged blood vessels, removing contaminated tissue, and creating surgical sites that would support eventual prosthetic limbs. It was some of the most challenging work she had ever performed, but the patient survived and would eventually return to active duty with advanced prosthetics. During the same casualty event, Sarah worked alongside Commander Morrison, who had volunteered to help with patient transport and logistics. She was impressed by his calm efficiency under pressure and his genuine concern for wounded soldiers, regardless of which unit they served. Many special operations personnel maintained an emotional distance from conventional forces, but Morrison seemed to view every injured soldier as a personal responsibility. As autumn progressed, the operational tempo at Chapman increased dramatically. Intelligence reports indicated that insurgent groups were planning a major offensive before winter weather limited their mobility. Sarah found herself treating more casualties as patrols encountered increased enemy activity. The injuries were becoming more severe as insurgents employed larger explosive devices and more sophisticated weapons. One particularly difficult case involved a female soldier from a military police unit who had been caught in a complex ambush. She had suffered gunshot wounds to the abdomen and chest, along with blast injuries from a roadside bomb. The combination of penetrating trauma and blast effects created a surgical challenge that pushed Sarah's skills to their limits. The soldier, Sergeant Lisa Chun, was barely conscious when she arrived at the hospital. Her vital signs were deteriorating rapidly, and initial imaging showed extensive internal bleeding. Sarah made the difficult decision to operate immediately rather than waiting for additional diagnostic information. The surgery lasted over 6 hours, requiring repairs to multiple organs and blood vessels. During the operation, Sarah noticed something unusual about the bullet wounds. The projectiles appeared to be armor-piercing rounds fired from a high-powered rifle, suggesting that the insurgents were using more advanced weapons than typically encountered. She made note of this information for intelligence analysts while continuing to work on saving Sergeant Chun's life. The surgery was successful, and Sergeant Chun made a full recovery. But the incident raised new concerns about enemy capabilities and tactics. Sarah found herself briefing intelligence personnel about the medical implications of the wounds she was treating. The patterns of injury provided valuable information about insurgent weapons, tactics, and training. Commander Morrison began including Sarah in mission planning sessions, recognizing that her medical expertise could influence tactical decisions. If she understood the specific risks associated with certain types of operations, she could better prepare for potential casualties. Sarah appreciated being included in the broader mission picture rather than simply waiting for casualties to arrive. Winter brought new challenges to Chapman. The mountain weather limited helicopter operations, meaning that casualties might face longer delays before reaching definitive medical care. Sarah worked with the aviation units to develop new protocols for medical evacuations in severe weather conditions. She also expanded the base's surgical capabilities to handle cases that might previously have been evacuated immediately. The isolation created by winter weather intensified the bonds between base personnel. Sarah found herself spending more time with the special operations teams, learning about their unique culture and challenges. She discovered that these elite soldiers faced not just physical dangers, but psychological pressures that conventional troops rarely encountered. Their missions often required them to make life and death decisions with limited information and no backup. Commander Morrison became a regular visitor to the hospital during his downtime. He seemed genuinely interested in Sarah's work and often asked thoughtful questions about military medicine. Their conversations ranged from tactical medicine to broader questions about the ethics of warfare and the obligations of those who served. Sarah found his perspective both challenging and refreshing. As the deployment progressed, Sarah realized that her role was expanding beyond traditional medical care. She was becoming an integral part of the base's operational planning, her medical expertise informing tactical decisions and mission parameters. The lines between healer and warrior were beginning to blur in ways she had never anticipated. The base's security posture also began to change as intelligence indicated increased threats to forward operating bases throughout the region. Sarah participated in additional security briefings and defensive training, learning about base protection measures and emergency response procedures. While she remained focused on her medical duties, she couldn't ignore the reality that Chapman was becoming a more dangerous place. Spring brought increased enemy activity as weather conditions improved and insurgent groups resumed major operations. Sarah noticed changes in the types of casualties arriving at the hospital, with more evidence of coordinated attacks and sophisticated weapons. The war was evolving, and she was witnessing that evolution through the wounds she treated. Commander Morrison's team was conducting increasingly dangerous missions, often operating for days at a time in hostile territory. Sarah found herself worried about their safety in ways that went beyond professional concern. She had come to respect Morrison and his men as dedicated professionals who risked everything to protect others. The thought of treating them as casualties rather than colleagues was something she preferred not to contemplate. Little did Sarah know that within weeks, she would face exactly that scenario. The war was about to come directly to her, challenging everything she believed about healing, duty, and the sacred obligation to preserve human life at any cost. The morning of May 15th began like any other at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Sarah completed her rounds at dawn, checking on patients who had arrived during the night. 2 soldiers were recovering from minor injuries sustained during a patrol, and an Afghan National Army soldier was being treated for a training accident. The relative quiet felt almost unusual after months of constant casualty flow. Commander Morrison's team had been out on a reconnaissance mission for 3 days, gathering intelligence on insurgent movements in the mountainous region near the Pakistani border. Sarah found herself checking the communication logs more frequently than usual, though she told herself it was merely professional concern for potential casualties. She had learned to recognize the signs of impending major operations, and something in the air suggested that significant action was coming. The first indication of trouble came at 1,147 hours when the base communications center received a fragmented radio transmission from Morrison's team. The message was broken by static and interference, but the words contact, casualties, and immediate evacuation came through clearly. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she prepared for incoming wounded, running through equipment checklists and alerting her medical team. Within minutes, every helicopter on the base was spinning up for a combat rescue mission. The initial reports suggested that Morrison's team had walked into a complex ambush involving multiple insurgent groups. Early estimates indicated at least 3 wounded SEALs, with the possibility of additional casualties among their Afghan partner forces. The helicopter pilots would have to fly into hostile territory under active enemy fire to extract the wounded. Sarah and her team prepared the operating theaters with practiced efficiency, laying out surgical instruments and checking blood supplies. She had performed this routine hundreds of times, but something about this particular mission felt different. Perhaps it was her personal connection to Morrison's team, or perhaps it was the unusual radio silence following the initial distress call. Whatever the reason, she found herself more anxious than usual as they waited for casualties to arrive. The rescue helicopters returned to Chapman at 1,423 hours, their approach announced by the distinctive sound of rotors under stress. Sarah could see tracers and smoke rising from the landing zone as the aircraft touched down, indicating that enemy forces were still actively engaging the rescue operation. The first helicopter disembarked 2 severely wounded SEALs, while the second carried Morrison himself, conscious but bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds. Sarah immediately began triaging the casualties, making rapid assessments of who needed surgery first. The most critically injured SEAL had sustained massive trauma to his chest and abdomen, with penetrating wounds that suggested high-velocity rifle fire. The second casualty had lost significant blood from wounds to his arms and legs, but his vital signs were more stable. Morrison was walking wounded, alert, and demanding updates on his men's conditions. "Doc, how bad are they?" Morrison asked as Sarah worked to stabilize his most critically injured teammate. Blood stained his tactical gear, and she could see multiple small wounds where shrapnel had penetrated his body armor. Despite his own injuries, his only concern was for his fellow SEALs. "Critical, but survivable if we move fast," Sarah replied, her hands already working to establish additional intravenous access on the severely wounded operator. "I need you to let my people check your wounds while I work on him." The surgery on the most critical patient lasted nearly 4 hours. Sarah worked with intense focus, repairing damaged organs and blood vessels while monitoring for signs of shock or internal bleeding. The wounds were complex, requiring innovative techniques to reconstruct damaged tissue and restore normal function. She drew on every skill she had learned during her deployments, pushing the boundaries of battlefield surgery. During the operation, Morrison remained in the hospital despite medical orders to rest and receive treatment for his own wounds. He coordinated with base commanders about ongoing rescue operations and provided detailed intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. Sarah could hear his voice in the background as she worked, calm and professional despite the chaos surrounding them. The patient survived the initial surgery, but his condition remained critical. Sarah knew that the next 24 hours would determine whether her efforts had been successful. She maintained a constant vigil beside his bed, monitoring vital signs and adjusting treatment protocols based on his response. The other wounded SEAL was stable and would make a full recovery, while Morrison had finally agreed to proper treatment of his multiple shrapnel wounds. That evening, as Sarah sat beside her critical patient monitoring his condition, Morrison approached her with an expression she had never seen before. The usual confidence and humor were replaced by something darker, more urgent. He had received updated intelligence about the ambush that had wounded his team, and the news was not encouraging. "Doc, we need to talk," Morrison said quietly, leading her to a private corner of the hospital. "The intel guys have been analyzing radio intercepts from the ambush. The insurgents know about our medical protocols. They know that wounded Americans get evacuated to Chapman for treatment." Sarah felt a chill despite the warm evening air. "What exactly are you saying?" "They're planning something," Morrison continued. "Multiple sources suggest they're going to hit the base directly, possibly targeting the hospital specifically. They want to kill wounded Americans and their medical staff to send a message." The implications hit Sarah immediately. The Geneva Convention was supposed to protect medical facilities from direct attack, but insurgent groups had never shown much respect for international law. If they were specifically targeting the hospital, every patient under her care was at risk, along with her entire medical team. Morrison's intelligence proved accurate sooner than anyone expected. The attack began at 0347 hours on May 17th, just 36 hours after his team had been ambushed. Sarah was performing emergency surgery on a soldier injured in a vehicle accident when the first mortar rounds impacted the base perimeter. The initial barrage was followed by coordinated small arms fire from multiple directions, indicating a sophisticated and well-planned assault. The hospital's emergency protocols required all non-essential personnel to take shelter in hardened bunkers while medical staff continued treating patients. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of trying to complete life-saving surgery while explosions shook the building around her. The patient on her table had suffered massive internal injuries in a vehicle rollover, and stopping the operation would certainly result in his death. As the attack intensified, Sarah realized that this was no random assault on base infrastructure. The incoming fire was specifically targeting the hospital building, with rounds impacting the walls and roof with alarming accuracy. Windows shattered from the concussions, and debris rained down on the operating table. The enemy was deliberately trying to kill wounded soldiers and medical personnel. Commander Morrison appeared in the operating theater despite being officially confined to bed rest. He was wearing full combat gear and carrying an assault rifle, his face grim with purpose. Behind him were two other SEALs who had been recovering from minor injuries, also armed and ready for combat. "Doc, we need to get everyone out of here now," Morrison said urgently. "This building is specifically targeted, and it's not going to hold much longer." Sarah looked down at the soldier on her operating table, then back at Morrison. "I can't leave him. He'll die if I stop now." "He'll die anyway if this building collapses on him," Morrison replied. "We're taking heavy fire from multiple directions, and base security is overwhelmed. The insurgents have somehow gotten inside the perimeter." As if to emphasize his point, a series of explosions rocked the hospital building, and Sarah could hear automatic weapons fire getting closer. Through the shattered windows, she could see muzzle flashes from positions that should have been secured by base defenses. The impossible was happening. Chapman was being overrun. Morrison made a command decision that would change everything. "My team is going to hold this position until you can finish the surgery. But if insurgents breach this building, you're going to need to defend yourself and your patients." He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a compact assault rifle, placing it on the equipment table beside Sarah's surgical instruments. The weapon looked alien and threatening next to her healing tools, a stark reminder that the sanctuary of the hospital was about to become a battlefield. "I've never fired a weapon in combat," Sarah said, her hands continuing to work on the patient's damaged organs even as her world shifted around her. "Then, pray you don't have to today," Morrison replied. "But if it comes down to saving your life or the lives of your patients, you do whatever it takes." The surgery continued under increasingly desperate conditions. Sarah worked with steady hands while explosions shook dust from the ceiling and automatic weapons fire echoed through the corridors. Morrison and his SEALs established defensive positions at the entrances to the operating theater, ready to repel any insurgents who might breach the building. As Sarah completed the final sutures on her patient, she could hear enemy voices in the hospital corridors. The insurgents had breached the building and were systematically searching for wounded Americans and medical personnel. Morrison's team was about to face overwhelming odds in a close-quarters battle that would determine whether Sarah's patients lived or died. The moment she had never imagined was approaching rapidly. Sarah Martinez, dedicated healer and saver of lives, was about to discover whether she could take a life to save others. The assault rifle beside her surgical instruments represented everything she had sworn to oppose, yet it might be the only thing standing between her patients and certain death. Morrison caught her eye as he prepared for the coming fight. "Doc, remember what I told you about doing whatever it takes?" Sarah nodded, her hand moving instinctively toward the unfamiliar weapon. Everything she had ever believed about healing, duty, and the sanctity of human life was about to be tested in ways she never could have prepared for. The war had finally come directly to her, and there would be no avoiding the choices that lay ahead. The sound of boots on concrete grew louder as insurgents moved systematically through the hospital corridors. Sarah could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, their voices filled with grim purpose as they searched for wounded Americans and medical personnel. Morrison's intelligence had been correct. This was not a random attack, but a calculated assault designed to terrorize coalition forces by targeting their most vulnerable members. Sarah completed her surgery as quickly as possible while Morrison and his two SEALs prepared defensive positions at the entrances to the operating theater. The patient's vital signs were stable, and she had done everything medically possible to save his life. Now the question was whether any of them would survive the next hour. "How many patients can't be moved?" Morrison asked quietly as he checked his weapon and ammunition. Sarah quickly assessed the situation in her mind. 3 critical patients, including this one, plus 2 others who are stable but sedated. The walking wounded have already been evacuated to the bunkers. 5 patients, 3 medical staff, and 3 SEALs, Morrison calculated grimly. Against an unknown number of insurgents who specifically want to kill everyone in this building. The first gunfire erupted from the main corridor as insurgents encountered base security personnel who had remained behind to protect the hospital. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of American M4 carbines mixing with the deeper reports of AK-47s and other insurgent weapons. The battle was getting closer with each passing minute. One of Morrison's SEALs, a young operator named Petty Officer Rodriguez, was positioned at the east entrance to the operating theater. He suddenly held up his hand in a warning gesture, indicating that he could hear movement approaching his position. Morrison moved silently to support him while the third SEAL, Chief Petty Officer Williams, maintained overwatch on the main corridor. Sarah found herself standing beside the assault rifle Morrison had placed on her equipment table. The weapon seemed to radiate an alien energy that conflicted with everything she believed about her role as a healer. She had taken the Hippocratic oath to, first, do no harm. Yet here was an instrument designed solely to cause harm to other human beings. The first insurgents appeared at Rodriguez's position without warning. They moved with tactical precision that suggested military training, wearing a mixture of civilian clothes and captured military equipment. Rodriguez engaged them immediately with controlled bursts of automatic fire, but more insurgents continued to pour into the corridor behind them. "Contact east," Rodriguez called out as he fell back toward the operating theater. He had been wounded in the initial exchange, blood staining his left shoulder where an insurgent round had found its mark. Morrison immediately moved to support him while Williams shifted position to cover the main entrance. Sarah watched the firefight unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. These men were fighting to protect her and her patients, risking their own lives to preserve the wounded soldiers under her care. The irony was not lost on her. Warriors becoming healers' protectors, violence employed in service of preserving life. The battle intensified as more insurgents joined the assault on the operating theater. Morrison and his team were heavily outnumbered, facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Sarah could see that they were running low on ammunition, and Rodriguez's shoulder wound was affecting his ability to fight effectively. "Doc, we need to move the patients now," Morrison called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "This position won't hold much longer." Sarah looked at her critical patients, knowing that moving them would likely result in their deaths. The soldier she had just operated on was barely stable, and the other critical patients were on life support equipment that couldn't be easily transported. Moving them would essentially be signing their death warrants. "I can't move the critical patients without killing them," Sarah replied. "Give me 15 more minutes to stabilize them for transport." "We don't have 15 minutes," Morrison responded grimly as another wave of insurgents appeared in the corridor. "They're bringing up heavy weapons." As if to prove his point, an explosion rocked the building as insurgents detonated a shaped charge against the exterior wall. The blast created a new breach that would allow attackers to bypass Morrison's defensive positions and enter the operating theater directly. Sarah realized that the sanctuary of the hospital had become a death trap. Williams engaged the insurgents at the new breach, but he was immediately overwhelmed by the number of attackers. Sarah watched in horror as he fell under concentrated enemy fire, his sacrifice buying precious seconds for the others to reposition. The insurgents were now inside the operating theater itself, directly threatening the wounded soldiers. Morrison made a desperate decision. "Rodriguez, cover the patients," he ordered. "Doc, you need to pick up that rifle now." Sarah looked at the weapon beside her surgical instruments, her mind racing through the implications. Everything in her training and moral framework rebelled against the idea of taking human life. She was a healer, dedicated to preserving life regardless of nationality or allegiance. Yet the insurgents advancing toward her patients showed no such restraint. "I can't," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the gunfire. "Look at your patients," Morrison replied urgently as he changed magazines. "Look at them, and tell me they deserve to die because of your oath." Sarah looked down at the soldier she had just operated on. He was barely 19 years old, with photos of his family taped to his equipment. The other critical patients were equally young, equally vulnerable, equally dependent on her protection. The insurgents advancing toward them showed no intention of taking prisoners or respecting medical neutrality. The moment of decision arrived with stunning suddenness. An insurgent appeared at the head of the closest patient's bed, raising an AK-47 to execute the wounded soldier at point-blank range. Sarah saw the muzzle of the weapon pointed directly at her patient's head, finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow as Sarah's hand moved toward the assault rifle. Her medical training had taught her to make life and death decisions in split seconds, and those same reflexes now guided her actions. She lifted the weapon, surprised by its weight, and the way it felt alien in her healing hands. The insurgent never saw her coming. Sarah's first burst caught him center mass, the impact throwing him backward away from her patient's bed. She was shocked by the weapon's recoil and the immediate, devastating effect of her shots. The insurgent fell without firing his own weapon, saving the wounded soldier's life. Morrison glanced at Sarah with approval and surprise. "Good shot. Document, keep that up." But Sarah was staring at the insurgent she had shot, watching blood pool beneath his body. She had just taken a human life for the first time, using the same hands that had saved countless others. The weight of that action threatened to overwhelm her even as more insurgents appeared in the operating theater. "No time for regrets," Morrison called out as he engaged another group of attackers. "Your patients need you to stay focused." Sarah forced herself to concentrate on the immediate threat rather than the moral implications of her actions. More insurgents were entering the operating theater, all of them intent on killing wounded Americans and medical personnel. She positioned herself between them and her patients, the assault rifle now feeling slightly more familiar in her hands. The firefight in the operating theater was unlike anything Sarah could have imagined. Medical equipment exploded around them as bullets struck monitors and for poles. Surgical instruments scattered across the floor, mixing with spent ammunition casings in a surreal combination of healing and violence. Rodriguez had taken additional wounds, but continued fighting from behind an overturned operating table. Morrison moved between positions with fluid grace, his years of combat experience evident in every tactical decision. Sarah found herself supporting them both, using the assault rifle to protect her patients from insurgents who showed no mercy for the wounded. During a brief lull in the fighting, Sarah checked on her patients. Miraculously, none of them had been struck by stray rounds, though their life support equipment was damaged. She worked quickly to restore their medical care while keeping the assault rifle within easy reach, a surreal combination of healing and preparation for violence. "How many more of them are there?" Sarah asked as she adjusted for medications with one hand while holding the rifle with the other. "Unknown," Morrison replied. "But base security is starting to push back. If we can hold for another few minutes, reinforcements should reach us." Those few minutes stretched into an eternity as Sarah defended her patients against repeated insurgent assaults. She discovered that her surgical training had prepared her for this in unexpected ways. The same steady hands and quick decision-making that served her in the operating room now helped her use the assault rifle effectively. Each time she fired the weapon, Sarah felt a piece of her former self die. She was no longer simply a healer but had become something else, a protector who would kill to preserve life. The contradiction tore at her soul, even as she continued to fight for her patient's survival. The sound of American weapons grew louder as base security forces fought their way toward the hospital. Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of Bradley fighting vehicles and helicopter gunships engaging insurgent positions. The tide of battle was finally turning, but the cost had been devastating. As the last insurgents in the operating theater were eliminated, Sarah found herself standing amid the wreckage of everything she had believed about healing and violence. Her hands were stained with both blood from surgery and gun oil from the assault rifle. She had saved lives by taking lives, protected the vulnerable by becoming a warrior. Morrison approached her carefully, recognizing the shock and moral conflict written across her face. "Doc, you saved them all. Your patients are alive because you were willing to fight for them." Sarah looked at the wounded soldiers under her care, then at the insurgents she had killed. The weight of her choices would haunt her for the rest of her life. But she knew that Morrison was right. Sometimes the greatest act of healing required the courage to do the unthinkable. The silence that followed the last gunshot was more unsettling than the battle itself. Sarah stood amid the wreckage of the operating theater, the assault rifle still in her hands, surrounded by the debris of shattered medical equipment and the bodies of insurgents she had killed. Smoke drifted through broken windows while the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the familiar hospital sense of antiseptic and blood. Morrison moved carefully through the room, checking each fallen insurgent to ensure they posed no further threat. His professional demeanor masked the concern Sarah could see in his eyes as he glanced toward her repeatedly. She remained frozen in place, staring at her patients who had somehow survived the assault, their monitors beeping steadily despite the chaos that had erupted around them. "Doc, we need to check on your patients," Morrison said gently, approaching Sarah with the same caution he might use with an unexploded device. "The fighting is over, but they still need medical care." Sarah blinked as if awakening from a trance, then carefully placed the assault rifle on a nearby table. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved toward her first patient, the young soldier she had operated on just hours earlier. His vital signs remained stable despite the trauma that had surrounded him, though his sedated state had probably protected him from the psychological impact of the battle. The other patients showed similar resilience, their bodies focused on healing while their minds remained blissfully unaware of how close they had come to execution. Sarah worked methodically to assess each one, replacing damaged monitoring equipment and adjusting medications as needed. The familiar routine of medical care provided some measure of comfort after the violence she had witnessed and participated in. Rodriguez had sustained additional wounds during the firefight, and Sarah immediately began treating his injuries while Morrison coordinated with incoming reinforcements. Base security forces were finally reaching the hospital, having fought their way through multiple insurgent positions to secure the building. The coordinated attack had been even larger than initially estimated, with over 200 insurgents participating in the assault. "Ma'am, we're going to need your statement about what happened here," said Major Collins, the base security commander who arrived with the relief force. He surveyed the operating theater with obvious shock, taking in the mixture of medical equipment and combat debris that told the story of an impossible situation. Sarah looked up from treating Rodriguez's wounds, her mind struggling to process the request. How could she explain that she had killed multiple human beings while trying to save others? How could she describe the moment when everything she believed about healing and violence had collapsed into a single, terrible choice? "The doctor saved all our lives," Morrison interjected firmly. "She held the line when we were about to be overrun, protected her patients, and kept fighting until reinforcements arrived. Without her actions, we'd all be dead right now." Major Collins nodded respectfully, but Sarah could see the questions in his eyes. A surgeon engaging in combat was unprecedented in his experience, and the implications would require careful investigation. The Army would need to understand exactly what had happened before determining how to respond to such an unusual situation. Over the following days, Sarah found herself the subject of intense scrutiny from multiple military organizations. The Judge Advocate General's office needed to determine whether her actions were legally justified under the rules of engagement. Medical Command wanted to understand how the situation had affected her ability to provide patient care. Mental health professionals were concerned about the psychological impact of combat on someone trained solely as a healer. The patients she had saved during the battle became her strongest advocates. Each one submitted detailed statements describing how Sarah had continued providing medical care even while defending them from insurgent attacks. Their families wrote letters expressing gratitude not just for her medical skills, but for her willingness to fight for their loved ones when fighting became necessary. Commander Morrison also provided crucial support during the investigation process. His detailed account of the battle emphasized Sarah's reluctance to take up arms and her continued focus on patient care throughout the engagement. He described her actions as heroic rather than problematic, arguing that she had embodied the highest traditions of military service. Dr. Martinez never stopped being a healer, Morrison told the investigating board. She just expanded her definition of healing to include protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When faced with an impossible choice, she chose to preserve life rather than preserve her own moral comfort. The investigation concluded that Sarah's actions had been fully justified under the circumstances. She had faced an immediate threat to helpless patients and had responded appropriately to protect them. The Army commended her for maintaining her medical duties while simultaneously defending her patients against overwhelming odds. But official vindication did little to ease Sarah's internal struggle with what she had done. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying the moment when she had first picked up the assault rifle. The faces of the insurgents she had killed haunted her dreams, even though she knew intellectually that their deaths had saved innocent lives. Dr. Patricia Webb, the base psychiatrist, worked closely with Sarah to help her process the traumatic events. Their sessions focused on understanding how someone dedicated to preserving life could reconcile taking life, even in defense of others. It was a philosophical and psychological challenge that few people ever faced so directly. You're struggling with what philosophers call the paradox of protective violence, Dr. Webb explained during one session. You used violence to prevent greater violence, killed to preserve life, harm to prevent greater harm. Your moral framework doesn't have categories for these contradictions, so your mind is trying to create them. Sarah appreciated the intellectual analysis, but her heart remained conflicted. She had crossed a line that she never expected to cross, and there was no returning to the person she had been before that moment in the operating theater. The question was whether she could find a way to integrate this new aspect of herself with her identity as a healer. The answer came gradually through her continued work with wounded soldiers. Sarah noticed that her patients responded differently to her after word of the battle spread throughout the base. They trusted her in ways that went beyond normal doctor-patient relationships, knowing that she had literally fought for their lives when they were most vulnerable. One patient, a young Marine who had lost both legs to an improvised explosive device, expressed it most clearly. "Doc, I know you'd do anything to save us," he said during a routine examination. "Most doctors care about their patients, but you were willing to kill for yours. That means something." Sarah realized that her actions in the operating theater had not diminished her role as a healer but had instead expanded it. She had demonstrated that preservation of life sometimes required the courage to take life, that protecting the innocent might demand becoming dangerous to those who threatened them. It was a terrible responsibility, but one that had saved lives when nothing else would have worked. The remainder of her deployment passed without similar incidents, but Sarah found that the experience had changed her approach to military medicine. She now understood viscerally that hospitals and combat zones were not sanctuaries, but rather targets that required active defense. She worked with base security to improve hospital protection protocols and trained other medical personnel in basic combat skills. Morrison's team fully recovered from their wounds and returned to operational status before Sarah's deployment ended. They maintained regular contact with her, understanding that she had become part of their brotherhood through shared combat experience. Morrison himself visited the hospital frequently, ostensibly for routine medical checks, but actually to ensure that Sarah was coping well with the aftermath of the battle. "You know you saved more than just our lives that day," Morrison told her during one visit. "You proved that healers can be warriors when necessary, that the commitment to preserve life is stronger than the prohibition against taking it." Sarah nodded, finally, beginning to accept the truth of his words. She had not stopped being a healer when she picked up that assault rifle. She had become a different kind of healer, one who understood that protecting life sometimes required the willingness to end it. When her deployment ended, Sarah returned to the United States with a chest full of commendations, including the Silver Star, the first ever awarded to a medical officer for combat action while providing patient care. The citation recognized her extraordinary heroism in defending wounded soldiers against overwhelming odds while continuing to provide life-saving medical treatment. More importantly, she returned home with a new understanding of her calling as a military physician. Sarah continued her career in Army medicine, but with an expanded perspective on what it meant to serve those who served their country. She became an advocate for improved combat medical training and hospital security, ensuring that other medical personnel would be better prepared if they ever faced similar situations. Years later, when people asked Sarah about the day she was supposed to heal but instead had to shoot, she would tell them that she had learned something profound about the nature of healing itself. Sometimes, she would explain, the greatest act of love for one person requires the willingness to become dangerous to another. Sometimes protecting the vulnerable means becoming their shield and their sword. The young doctor who had entered that operating theater believing in absolute moral categories had emerged as a more complex, but ultimately more effective healer. She had discovered that the line between healing and harming was not as clear as she had once believed, and that the highest calling of a physician might sometimes require the courage to cross that line in defense of those who could not defend themselves. Sarah Martinez had been supposed to heal, not shoot. But when healing required shooting, she had found the courage to do both. In that moment of impossible choice, she had discovered that the truest act of healing might sometimes be the willingness to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. It was a lesson that would guide the rest of her career and define her understanding of what it truly meant to serve.